And so next presentation will be by Stephanie Dix. She will actually have present a historical perspective. She's a scholar that studies science and technology studies and the history of science with a particular interest in computation, mathematics and AI. And she's a professor in the School of Communication in Simon Fraser University in British Columbia.
Thank you, Ronald. That was wise, Thomas. Thank you. Well, it's such an honor to be here. I am a historian of science, a historical epistemologist, and I've spent the last 15 years exploring histories of automated theorem proving, 20th century mathematics in the United States, artificial intelligence, and it came as quite a surprise to me that this work was suddenly relevant in very new ways with the advent of Lean. And I'm here to share some historical perspectives that I think might be relevant for many of the conversations mathematicians are being encouraged to have today in the face of these large-scale automation efforts. So one of the central claims that I've made across basically all of my work is that any time someone proclaims that the computer has done a thing, that it has composed a poem or proved a theorem or recognized a face or done anything at all, that task has had to be redefined in some fundamental way to become the kind of thing that a computer can do. The task has to be reconceptualized, reimagined through the lens of the machine, transformed into its languages and formal systems, transformed with its capacities and limitations in mind. And I think there's no automation at any moment in history that doesn't come with these sometimes really fundamental reconceptualizations of objects, problems, questions, processes. And I think sometimes we're a little too quick to accept the proclamation that the computer has done the thing without attending to the transformations in what that task even means that have made the automation or the claim possible. So for me, I actually don't see the history of computing as a history in which computers have been made better and better at doing harder and harder things. It is also certainly a history in which we have translated more and more of our questions, our concerns, our subject matter, our activities into the languages and formalisms and contexts of the machine. And in that way, I think we truly work as hard for our technology as it works for us, but in ways that we don't always recognize or appreciate, right? So my questions have been, what did intelligence become so that the computer could be said to have it? What was reasoning such that it could be said to reason? What was knowledge such that we think there can be automated databases of expert knowledge in mathematics or anywhere else? And I'm going to talk a little bit about, in broad strokes, some different redefinitions or disagreements about the very stakes of the matter that automated theorem proving in the second half of the 20th century in the United States, which is my area of expertise, sort of present to us. And for many, the project of automating mathematical intelligence started out as a project of automated reasoning. And it was believed that mathematical intelligence inhered in a reasoning capacity in some fundamental way. But there were many different reasons and ideas about reasoning at work that I think are helpful to point to. And I'll start with what I assume is a likely very well-known understanding of reasoning that developed and proliferated within the American defense establishment during the post-war period that has had a fairly outsized impact on several 20th century histories, namely the vision of reasoning that Alan Newell and Herbert Simon came up with as symbolic information processing, which emerged from their work at the Rand Corporation. And for those who are unfamiliar, historians of science are insistent that it's not so easy as we might think to take knowledge out of its context. And so I think in order to appreciate what this moment in the history of computation and mathematics represented, you have to see it in its context. And RAND, for those who are unfamiliar, was founded at the end of the Second World War, largely funded by the US Air Force. And RAND researchers were tasked with predicting what future global warfare was going to look like and coming up with strategies for how to optimize and win future wars. And this was a difficult undertaking, in large part because there were so many unknowns about future warfare. What weapons technologies, what new sort of political perspectives or ideologies, what geopolitical regions, what nations would be involved in a future war couldn't be known in advance. And so a lot of research at the RAND Corporation was about trying to find ways to model and predict and optimize warfaring without knowing those details. RAND researchers pulled away across the board from material specificity, from locality, to look instead at abstract models and techniques that they hope could apply to many future wars, whatever they ended up being. And one particularly influential approach, alongside game theory and others, was, of course, systems engineering, which was ported out of the American defense establishment and has come to structure a lot of modern life. Systems engineering offered one approach to this uncertainty about the future, drawing from control systems engineering, management sciences, operations research, and cybernetics, rather than worry about all of the specifics of a war, a nation. Systems engineers look at the world in terms of the abstract relations between parts, abstracting away from a particular government, a particular communications infrastructure, a particular economy, to try and understand the mathematical relationships between component parts. And also, RAND researchers were really interested in what information circulated or ought to circulate and how it ought to circulate between the different branches of, for example, a corporation or a military or a government. And this, they thought, gave them a way to study and plan for future warfare with a lot of uncertainty. Regardless of what weapons, what nations, what governments, what geographical regions were at stake, they hoped that their formal and abstract models and optimization strategies for communication, decision-making, problem-solving, and planning would apply in that event. Everything in their hands almost could be made into a system. Governments were systems, the guns on a plane were systems, the economy was a system, transportation infrastructure was a system. And of course, in this context within which both Newell and Simon worked extensively, they offered that human minds and computers should be studied and could be understood as systems as well. And more than that, that they were the same kind of system, species of the same genus, as Simon famously put it, namely symbolic information processing systems that took symbolic information as input and manipulated that symbolic information according to a set of rules in order to solve problems, formulate judgments, come up with risk assessments, and so on. For them, it was this abstract capacity for symbolic information that determined a reasoning faculty and with it intelligence. For them, the material substrata was not relevant. You could be a brain in a vat, you could be a brain in a body, it could be a hybrid assemblage of humans and machines, it could be a corporation, it could be a classroom of students. It didn't matter what the components were that carried out the operation. So long as a system could take the certain types of symbolic information as input, manipulate it appropriately, it could be intelligent. And they wrote, "We wish to emphasize that we are not using computers as a crude analogy to human behavior. Our position is that the appropriate way to describe a piece of problem-solving behavior is in terms of a program. In terms of certain elementary information processes it is capable of performing." This assertion has nothing to do directly with computers. Computers come into the picture only because they can, by appropriate programming, be induced to execute the same sequences of information processes that humans execute when they are solving problems. Hence, programs describe both human and machine problem solving at the level of information processes. And their view really was that if you could figure out what the elementary information processing steps were, you could write a program constituted by them, and it would describe both the human and the machine intelligence at the same time. They were advocates for abstraction, for a vision of intelligence and its constituent processes and faculties as independent of materiality in a fundamental way. And the logic theory machine was famously their first attempt to actually identify and automate the information processes they believed to be at work in a particular domain of human reasoning. And specifically, the logic theory machine was designed to prove theorems from, famous to everyone in this room, I'm sure, canonical texts in early 20th century mathematics and logic, Principia Mathematica, written by Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell around the turn of the 20th century. An earlier attempt to try and consolidate all of mathematics in one place, put it in one standard formal system, get it all onto the pages of these 3 volumes, in response to earlier anxieties about mathematics becoming too prolific and plural for the likings of many British mathematicians. So in order to realize a project like this, Newell and Simon first needed a theory or a model of what it is humans do when they prove mathematical theorems. What are the information processing rules that need to be followed, and how can they be broken down and automated? And for that model, they turned to a mathematician by the name of George Polya, a Hungarian who had escaped to the United States in 1940 and spent his career at Stanford, where Newell took every class he offered. And Polya was deeply interested in problems of mathematics pedagogy. And he believed, like many in this room, that contrary to some of the powerful idealizations and mythologies about mathematics, mathematicians do not just sit around deducing consequences from axioms in hopes of arriving at interesting truth theorems. They do all kinds of things. They try to come up with counterexamples, they experiment with cases, they work backwards and look for analogous problems, they build models, they have all kinds of tricks. And Polya didn't think that these tricks were esoteric and tacit and undescribable. He thought they could be identified and named and formalized as rules for what he called plausible inference and taught to students to make them better practicing mathematicians. He said, certainly let us learn proving, let us learn to deduce consequences from axioms, but also let us learn guessing. And of course, he called these ways of guessing heuristics, from the Greek word heuriskein. It means to find. It's a navigational term. The heuristics were meant to be wayfinders in big problem domains. And Polya published books of rules that he thought accounted for actual mathematical practice, and these were the foundation of Newell and Simon's imagining of the symbolic information processing that went in to logic proving. And in particular, the logic theory machine also did not start with the axioms from Principia and go about implying its inference or applying its inference principles, hoping to find theorems from the volumes. This, of course, would have produced an exponential explosion of data and had been ruled out as a possibility earlier in the 1950s. The logic theorist worked backwards, kind of by what I call inferential reverse engineering. It started with the problem that it wanted to solve, and then it would generate a set of subproblems that, if true, would lead to that conclusion in a single permissible inference step, and then it would generate a set of subproblems for those subproblems, and so on, in hopes that eventually the axioms or previously established theorems would be generated as subproblems, and you could run that path backwards and have a nice proof of your theorem. Didn't always work. Provably, it doesn't work in certain cases, but they had some success with this. And they acknowledged it was just a first step, but they believed that they had captured something very fundamental about what reasoning is. And it was an impactful model. This was the only running computer program that was presented at the infamous 1956 Dartmouth Summer Conference on Artificial Intelligence. And of course, famously, many researchers take up this vision of intelligence as rooted in reasoning and reasoning as rule-bound symbolic information processing. And they went out into the world trying to find the heuristics for medical diagnosis or synthetic chemistry and so on to build their artificial intelligences. Tellingly, I think neither Newell nor Simon actually had the experience required with computers to implement this vision that they had. And Simon had very little to do, in spite of how celebrated he is, with the implementation of this idea on the Joniac mainframe and its 52 kilobytes of memory. And so to actually create a running program, Newell and Simon had to enlist a much less famous third collaborator, John Clifford Shaw, who joined the RAND Numeric Analysis Department, which would later be renamed the Programming Department at the RAND Corporation after the war. The only space that was large enough at RAND to accommodate the computers was the basement, and they called it the sweatshop because the men working in that room often worked without shirts. They packed heavy boxes of punch cards back and forth between machines. It was loud. It was hot. And tellingly, I think Shaw didn't buy at all the similarity that Newell and Simon were advocating for between the computer and the mind. In these days, the closer you were to the machine and the more engaged in implementation rather than abstraction you were, the less convinced I think you were by the comparison. So primarily, Shaw and Newell spent a lot of time experimenting with and simulating and trying out different possible ways of representing logical propositions in computer memory that would lend themselves to this backwards engineering and subproblem chaining. And after a lot of experimentation, they landed on the linked list. Anyone in the room, of course, who programs will be familiar with linked lists, totally ubiquitous data structures that can be implemented in almost any programming language. But they were first developed in this context as a way of representing logical propositions. And those rules of reasoning, those heuristic rules that Newell and Simon were trying to hold on to from human practice in their automation were eventually translated into list processing operations in the information processing language, a predecessor to Lisp. And all were agreed that list processing and linked lists were not intuitive tools for human cognition. So even in trying to preserve human practice, they nonetheless had to account for and accommodate the material specificity of the computer. And at that level, the comparison afforded by systems engineering of the similarity at a distance sort of starts to fall apart a little bit. In spite of its outsized impact on AI and everything that followed, there were many critics of this vision of intelligence as reasoning and as reasoning as rule-bound symbolic information processing. We could have a whole talk about those people, but I'll tell you about just one who is a person I've spent a lot of my time and career doing research on, a Chinese-American logician by the name of Hao Wang. So Wang was a philosopher, an analytic philosopher and logician, but over the course of his career, he became very critical of both analytic philosophy and logic, in large part because he felt the abstractions in which they trafficked were just fictions, being treated as real, but that bore so little relationship to the reality of they were abstracted from to be particularly useful. He was concerned that the abstractions at the heart of analytic philosophy, logic, and AI just didn't grab a hold of enough reality to honor or guide the messy realities of human experience. He said he entered philosophy to study what he called the human dilemma, but found that dilemma of the human condition not so well represented in the very disciplines he gave his whole life to. And he proposed that Newell and Simon and those who approached the problem of AI as they did had made a fundamental mistake. They mistook the fiction of people that led them mistakenly to see the computer as the same kind of thing. He said logicians had worked with the fiction of man as a persistent and unimaginative beast who can only follow rules. And then the fiction found its incarnation in the machine. It was an understandable mistake, Wang thought, because human minds had so often been idealized, abstracted, and modeled as disembodied rule-following entities, especially by his colleagues and predecessors in logic and philosophy, who had long sought to find a formalism to represent human reasoning. and often who, of course, in turn looked at embodiment, emotion, the other facets of the human dilemma as the enemy of reason, right? The root of irrationality, an impediment to right reasoning. And one crucial tenet of these abstracted theories of mind is a presumed universalism. The idea that it's the same reasoning faculty at work in chemists, physicists, mathematicians, at work in the law, at work across cultural contexts, across history. There is a belief in a kind of universal reason. And Wang didn't accept that, and I think it's a really interesting conversation. He said, a particular act of recognition or reasoning depends on one's genes, the history of one's mind and body, some essential relation to desire, even race, class, sex, and many other factors. And of most of these factors, he goes on to say, we have at best an imperfect knowledge and understanding. Wang just rejected the assumption that human reasoning could be reduced to a universal formalism, because he believed that people reason differently based on their context, their training, their experience, the history of their mind and body. And of course, those of you who are familiar, he is speaking from a materialist position in making this claim. And of course, he indeed was trained in both materialist philosophy in China, where he grew up and did his first 2 degrees, and also, I discovered in his archives, had a deep interest in Marxism as well during this time. Wang's rejection of universal reason was grounded in part in that training, and Marxism, he thought, unlike analytic philosophy, might be better suited to the study of the human dilemma, because rather than abstracting them away, Marxists tend to emphasize materiality, history, and embodiment, and because it offered a theory of social change that Wang thought was incredibly important. He said, although there was much that puzzled me in Marxism, I felt that I saw a comprehensive philosophy unifying thought and action in a way that I had not before considered possible. And it was this desire to bridge thought and action to a sort of connect abstraction to messy lived reality in new ways that brought Wang to computers in the first place. He saw in the modern digital computer not any similarity to humans, but rather a deep difference. He said, the human ability to command precisely any great mass of details sets an intrinsic limitation on the kind of thing that is done in mathematics and the manner in which it is done. The superiority of machines in this respect indicates that machines, while following the broad outline of paths drawn up by man, might yield surprising new results by making many new turns which man is not accustomed to taking. We are, in fact, faced with a challenge to devise methods of buying originality with plodding, now that we are in possession of slaves, which are such persistent plodders. So this was not artificial intelligence. This was buying originality with plodding, which I actually think might be a better name for a lot of what gets called AI today and in general. But whereas Newell and Simon had recognized an incarnation of the fiction of the intelligent human mind as rule-bound reasoners, in the computer, Wang had recognized instead the abstract fictional idea of the slave, right? The slave was imagined as inhuman, rule-obeying, and mindless, and that fiction was, of course, also untrue, and very violently so, of enslaved people. It's a different fiction about how the work gets done, right? So in the late 1950s, Wang was lecturing in philosophy at Harvard and Oxford, but driven by his dissatisfaction with those fields, he spent his summers at IBM and Bell Research Labs and the Burroughs Corporation, where he too developed a set of computer programs for proving theorems in Principia Mathematica. And in his critique of analytic philosophy, Wang was particularly disappointed, it's real disappointment, about the fact that not even mathematicians seem to have much use for mathematical logic. He thought he was in the business of developing and exploring and studying formal systems that were meant to be foundational in some way to mathematics, and yet not even mathematicians could easily or readily make use of them. He said a common complaint among mathematicians is that logicians, when engaged in formalization, are largely concerned with hair splitting. It is sufficient to know that proofs can be formalized. Why should one take all the trouble to show exactly how such formalizations are to be done, or to carry out actual formalizations? Russell and Whitehead, of course, famously or maybe infamously didn't get around to proving that 1 + 1 = 2 until more than 200 pages into Principia. It was incredibly cumbersome to work within that particular formal system. But Wang wondered, what if logic actually contains all kinds of hidden insights, things we didn't know to look for before within it? What if the computer could make logic more useful for practicing mathematicians? That was what he wanted to use computers for, to take the abstractions of logic and look at them with new eyes through the lens of what the computer could do, and then see if there was new ways of actually doing mathematical work. So his approach to proving theorems in Principia was not based on a theory of how humans do it, but was rather based on a fundamental result from a branch of logic called proof theory, namely Eyerbrand's theorem, which was proved by a French logician, Jacques Eyerbrand, in 1930, before he died very tragically and very young in the mountains. And in a different talk, I would take you through the whole set of programs and how they worked, but if you want to read about that, you can read about that. I'm trying to do more of an overview than get into the weeds of any particular one of these approaches to automation, but suffice it to say, Wang did identify previously unappreciated structural features of Eyerbrand's theorem that wouldn't be useful to a human. They would require discharging trillions of rows in a truth table, essentially, but that the computer could do. And it made Eyerbrand's theorem have a different ontological and epistemic status for Wang. He thought Eyerbrand's theorem has become something new because we could find in it information that hadn't been useful to us before. So whereas Newell and Simon wanted to recreate human practice in the machine by automating some universal reasoning faculty, Wang wanted to keep human creativity and ingenuity and understanding and knowledge very central to working with computers by buying originality with plotting, which was only possible when you came to see logic with new perspectives, to find or create previously unseen possibilities within some of the abstractions that told us interesting things about mathematics, but maybe did not offer tools for doing mathematics. And it was this same desire to bridge thought and action, and for thought and action to be aligned, this same desire for abstraction and philosophy to do justice to what we know, as he put it, that also brought Wang to Marxist philosophy. And just out of curiosity, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI to see if Wang had been under surveillance, and he was. In 1956, Wang was sailing between New York and London as he was lecturing at Harvard and Oxford, and he was stopped because he was found to be transporting undeclared electronics components that exceeded the limit after an unknown colleague reported to the FBI that he was planning to transport electronics to China for the purpose of nuclear arms development. That turned out not at all to be the case. None of the components were controlled as nuclear secrets. All were very standard for computing research at the time. And Wang was, in fact, transporting them on behalf of another colleague of his who had already been subjected to the violence of McCarthyist surveillance and was worried that he would be unable to continue his research from being barred from bringing electronics components out of the United States. But Wang was also found at that time to have a number of Marxist pamphlets and literature in his suitcases. And this image of him sailing between arguably the two most analytic philosophy departments in the world at the time, Harvard and Oxford, with a suitcase full of computer parts and Marxist literature, I think captures something really interesting and really fundamental about Wang's experience of the Cold War world, as well as his questions about minds, machines, and lived experience. In some ways, I think he proves his own point, right? He reasoned differently about logic, mathematics, and computation because his lived experience was different, right? Because he came with materialist training, because he had a different experience of American academia, and so on. So Wang didn't want computers to reify some abstracted fiction of life, intelligence, and knowledge. He wanted computers to be an active part of the messy reality, allowing us to experiment with abstraction in new ways and find new utility and insights from logical formalisms that the computer could make useful in ways we perhaps could not. He rejected the universal theory of reasoning and heuristic reasoning purported by Newell and Simon and emphasized embodiment and experience in shaping human intelligence and human reasoning. And he wanted the computer to become a new landscape for experience that could participate in the project of cultivating reason and bridging thought and action. There were yet other visions of reasoning that took place during this period. I won't get to them all, but I want to end this first bit with one particularly influential vision of reasoning that took shape at the Argonne National Laboratory just outside of Chicago in the 1960s. Beginning in 1961, a man named John Allen Robinson came to Argonne for the summers as a research associate, and there developed an interest in automated theorem proving, which was a central focus of the Applied Mathematics Division at Argonne under the directorship of Larry Wass. And Robinson came to the United States with a classics degree from Cambridge to study philosophy at Princeton. And he, like Wang, came to believe that computers and human minds are qualitatively as well as quantitatively different, and that there was no reason to expect or to demand that the logic they use, the rules of inference they apply, and the kinds of reasoning they bring to mathematical work should be the same. He quite famously wrote, "Traditionally, a single step in deduction has been required for pragmatic and psychological reasons to be simple enough, broadly speaking, to be apprehended as correct by a human being in a single intellectual act. When the agent carrying out the application of an inference principle is a modern machine, the traditional limitation on the complexity of inference principles is no longer very appropriate. More powerful principles, involving perhaps a much greater amount of combinatorial information processing for single application, become a possibility. Reasoning is about giving your reasons, right? It's about explaining how we get from one thought or one idea or one concept to the next. And when these competing definitions of reasoning start to emerge, what's at stake in them is what counts as a step, right? What can you do in one step in a process of reasoning? And resolution offered a really powerful reasoning mechanism where if you had expressions in a particular form, and we actually saw resolution at work earlier this week for those who were at the workshop all week, and it allows you to simplify and combine parent clauses if they contain complementary literals, and it turned out to be an incredibly efficient and powerful rule for proving logic theorems in the predicate calculus. Again, no time for details, but I've written about them if you want to read about them. And resolution had an enormous impact on the establishment of a field called variously automated theorem proving, automated deduction, or automated reasoning throughout the 1970s and 80s. And the idea that logic could and should be decoupled from human psychology to capitalize on what was computationally possible, even if the computer would take steps that we could not follow in a single intellectual act, but might have to do a lot more work to convince ourselves of, became somewhat paradigmatic for the whole field. It also became really controversial and wasn't always of very much interest to mathematicians because resolution proofs tended to be really difficult to read or to interpret and make sense of, and often they were extremely long. And so a lot of really interesting debates during the 1970s and 80s related to whether these are proofs at all. Many of the questions we're asking all week this week, like what is mathematics for? Why do we do it? How do we do it? They were having those conversations about resolution as well. There were also many critics of resolution for the alienating effect they thought it had on human understanding, and for the reason that resolution-based proofs are so difficult often to read and interpret. and to understand why something is the case and not just that it is as a formal property. But much to my surprise, one of those critics ended up being John Allen Robinson himself. I saw him speak and had a chance to interview him in 2012 at the Conference on Automated Deduction that was convened in Manchester, in part as a part of the honoring of the centenary of Alan Turing's birth. And at this conference, Robinson proclaimed to a room full of people largely continuing to work in the paradigm that he established. He said, quote, "In fact, formalization is not the thing we do when we're interested in truth. It's no good just following step by step a proof and saying, okay, 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 if you don't really have understanding, if you don't really know what's going on. You haven't really understood a proof if all you did is verify it. It's only if you look into the ideas under that sequence of inference that you have understood the proof," end quote. So Robinson proposed that it was to those ideals and insights and to human understanding that the field should turn. He said, quote, "That's where we should go next." So I thought that was very interesting. So these were just three of even more diverging perspectives on what reasoning is and how it should or could be automated, what ought to count as a permissible step, and where humans fit that took shape in these very early encounters with computers and early questions about the possibilities of automation. We had reasoning as universal rule-bound symbolic information processing from Alan Newell and Herbert Simon and much of the early artificial intelligence community. For Wang, we have this materialist theory of reasoning as embodied and experiential and not, in fact, universal or rule-bound, a reality of thinking that's messier than our attempts to formalize it. And then we have these computer-oriented logics like resolution that were meant to decouple inference from human psychology and see if the possibilities of modern digital computers could lead us to new and different logics. However, there were also those who did not think that the automation of mathematical intelligence could just be a project of automated reasoning. Others rejected the very idea that reasoning was all that is required for intelligence, and an early alternative vision was that intelligence inheres in knowledge as well. It's not enough to automate reasoning and hope you can apply the automated reasoning faculty to any problem domain whatsoever. You might need domain-specific expert knowledge to be encoded for the purposes of automation as well. So I want to talk a little bit about MIT's Maxima system, the Project Max symbolic manipulator, which was the first sort of large-scale, nationally distributed computer algebra system developed at MIT in the 1960s until 1981, when it was privatized. That's, again, another story. But Maxima was designed to assist in mathematical problem solving. It was supposed to offer ready-made libraries of automated tools, functions, and procedures that were supposed to help mathematicians, engineers, and other technical practitioners in problem solving and even theorem proving. Maxima could integrate, it could simplify expressions, it could multiply matrices, it had some inferential capacities. It could do a lot of what mathematical and technical practitioners have to do, often very tediously on paper. And Maxima was an example of a so-called expert system, an approach to AI that hoped to elicit and extract and make explicit what experts in different fields know and encode that knowledge procedurally to make it available for automation. By the 1990s, Maxima had been largely displaced by more powerful and user-friendly systems, like ones many of you know, I'm sure, but it's actually still in use today in a kind of open source version. A student of Herbert Simon, Edward Feigenbaum, criticized early artificial intelligence like theirs by saying, we must hypothesize from our experience to date that the problem-solving power exhibited in an intelligent agent's performance is primarily a consequence of the specialist's knowledge employed by the agent and only very secondarily related to the generality and power of the inference method employed. Our agents must be knowledge-rich, even if they are methods-poor. So the idea here was not to try to seek out some magical human-oriented, natural, or computer-oriented reasoning faculty and automate it and hope to have intelligent behavior in your computer. You would also need, according to this view, to make knowledge available to your computers as well. So what did they think knowledge consisted in? I can only hope they were being a bit glib here, but Joel Moses, a mathematician at MIT who directed this project, wrote, "A rough hypothesis is that a mathematician knows perhaps 10,000 mathematical facts. For example, if a student learned 4 facts an hour, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year for 4 years, he would learn some 12,000 facts. The average mathematician may not be able to sustain this pace with complete retention, but he has been learning for a longer period." So even if they're being a bit glib, there is definitely a theory of knowledge here, right? That what mathematicians know is a bunch of discrete facts, and the hope was that all of them were actually how-to knowledge, that what mathematicians know is how to do this, how to do this, how to do that, how to do that, and that knowledge could be automated and built into a centralized repository. So unlike some other algebraic systems and more recent formalization systems, Maxima was agnostic to questions about foundations and standardized formalisms. Moses insisted, actually for some political reasons we could talk about later if you're interested, that Maxima would be modular. Each module was a stand-alone automation of some mathematical capacity, procedurally defined and automated. So to solve a problem with Maxima was to break the problem down into a series of subproblems, each of which was solvable by a module of the system, and then to run those modules in sequence. And this very explicitly introduced a notion that to do mathematics was to program, right? It brought the language and the practice of programming into the practice of mathematics. And Moses said, part of what made Maxima hard to use, part of the problem is that one is mixing two worlds, the world of mathematics and the world of programming. We may imagine that there are some natural affinities between these two worlds, but there are also many deep frictions and divergences. As another Maxima developer, Michael Gnezareth, wrote, Maxima was a conception of mathematical knowledge as a body of programming rules, and that the only way to use the system was to learn to ask your questions, formulate your definitions procedurally and in accordance with the language of the system. And I want to say a little bit about what I think is a perennial problem. It'll be a problem so long as we're using computers, but it came through really starkly in the context of Maxima, which is that there are competing needs at stake, right? The needs of developers, the people who build and maintain these systems, and the needs of would-be users. And balancing those competing needs, often that are unresolvable, right, can lead to some of the really interesting realities of automated proof. So, we may prefer to work with the expression on top. These two expressions are equivalent. They return the same value no matter what theta is. And we might prefer to work with the shorter expression. That's a sort of old idea. We prefer the shorter expressions. But for the Maxima developers, it was a simpler choice to only implement cosine and do all trigonometric computation in terms of cosine, because that was the more economical choice from a computational perspective. But it led to so many difficulties for the people who were expected to work with these more computer-oriented formalisms. Joel Moses thought this problem was so interesting, he wrote an entire paper about algebraic simplification where he said, simplification is the most pervasive process in algebraic manipulation. It is also the most controversial. Much of the controversy is due to the difference between the desires of a user and those of a system designer. The user wants expressions which he can comprehend, which usually means that the expressions presented to the user should be small. The designer wants expressions that can be manipulated with great ease and efficiency. And Moses, I think, had a lot of clarity when he used political analogies to describe these problems. Because ultimately, decisions about automation are decisions about how much freedom people will have, about where to allocate resources, about how much people will be expected to conform to ways of speaking, ways of representing, ways of formalizing. So there were the radicals, the New Left, the liberals, the conservatives. Maxim was Catholic in the little C sense of having different tools, whatever tool for the moment, right? So he thought that decisions about automation are decisions about cognitive and epistemic flexibility, decisions about resources. They actually resemble a lot of the decisions that different political orientations are trying to make about collective life. And I think I have 2 minutes. Is that okay to finish up? All right. So the Maxima project, in part because of Joel Moses' own political proclivities, was really committed to pluralism and flexibility. Every module could have its own root logic, its own representational scheme. This would be a mess for developers, but they really aspired to try and accommodate as much flexibility as possible. And there were other projects in the second half of the 20th century that had the exact opposite vision, right? The one root logic, the one representational scheme, the one formal system. They want everybody writing up all of mathematics in a shared language. And they also get really political when they talk about what they're trying to do. So I'll, just to finish, give you one example of this alternative vision. That was the QED project, launched with an anonymously authored manifesto in 1994. If, in fact, we do end up writing a manifesto, I hope it's different from this manifesto. So you say, although there are a variety of logics, there is little doubt that one can describe all important logics within an elementary logic, such as primitive recursive arithmetic, about which there is no doubt, and within which one can reliably check proofs presented in the more controversial logics. We plan to build the QED system upon such a root logic. The standard impartial answer to the question, has it been proved, could become, has it been checked by the QED system? Such a mechanical proof checker could provide answers immune to the pressures of emotion, fashion, and politics, and yet they go on to display a lot of emotion and fashion and politics by saying, in the last 100 years, many traditional cultural values of our civilization, and who's the we here, right, have taken a severe beating. The QED system will provide a beautiful and compelling monument to the fundamental reality of truth. It will thus provide some antidote to the degenerative effects of cultural relativism and nihilism. They were really writing in the genre, right? And then there was a massive email discussion that lasted many years where they tried to get from manifesto to system with no small difficulty. And I will leave you with the thoughts of Cal, whose last name we never knew, from the Aerospace Corporation, who said, I have read the QED manifesto and the subsequent discussion with much interest and not a little horror. It just irritates me to see that naivete about the way to do mathematics. I have no doubt that each of you who write the way math is or should be being done is right about a way it is being done. My complaint is just that none of you take into account the enormously different styles of methods that are in use. And the fifth motivation, that's the one to be a monument to universal truth that works against the culturally degenerative effects of relativism and nihilism. He says, the fifth motivation is too militaristic for me. If the thought police return, they will be the ones who have QED, not us. So from these histories, I think it's interesting that previous approaches to automation, even though they didn't garner much interest from research mathematicians, raised a lot of the questions that I think we're now discussing. I think this dream of total consolidation and formalization, the unity of mathematics, it's a very old idea, of course, and it always seems to be out of reach, right? And I think that is actually the structuring feature of the dream. And I just think math is full of all these unresolvable tensions, right? Between formalization and understanding, between the universal and the local, between the mind and the body, between the abstractions and the messy reality. I don't think we can resolve them, right? But maybe something about mathematics is sort of staying with that trouble. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Sorry for going so over.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, and if only to remind us that all of this is happening in a long intellectual discussion. And whoever's writing about this now, I have to think about the historian that in 50 years will actually give a presentation and present us with your quotes. We're getting close to the coffee break, but let's see whether there's like one or two short questions for Stephanie. Yes, please.
Isn't the lean system, the QED manifesto system, finally arrived?
So the question is Lean now the QED manifesto arrived? I mean, I was very interested to hear from Thomas that the math lib isn't comprehensive, right? Even for some undergraduate mathematics, or I can't remember what you said exactly, but that's the dream, right? So I was going to talk about it, ran out of time. I always run out of time. There was a whole reboot of QED in the early 2000s where people were like, now that we have the right type theory, we'll be able to do it. And now it's like, now we have Lean and we'll be able to do it. And maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe one of these systems eventually will become the comprehensive unifying repository that is the dream, but I just don't think so. I think mathematics overflows its formalisms, right? It always does, and that means that, you know, unless we redefine mathematics to be only what is in these automatically verified systems, which is something that might happen, right? We might redefine mathematics in these terms. I think as long as we don't, there will always be overflow, incompleteness. Every attempt at an encyclopedia of any kind through centuries or millennia of history has always been incomplete, right? And I think we want it. We want all the truth all in the one place, fixed, solid, right? But it's harder to have that than we think.
That's, by the way, perfect conclusion. Math cannot be bottled up. I'm just looking up if there are any other questions. Yes, please. And speak up.
Yeah, so thank you for a wonderful talk. So you've talked about the way our images of intelligence and reasoning and rationality both dictate the implementations and are dictated by them. But now, machine learning, generative AI, they give us entirely new images of reasoning and rationality and intelligence. Have you thought about those images and how they relate to the past ones and what the past ones can tell us about what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I teach the history of AI is that the so-called winters, where the symbolic rule-bound methods failed, were actually really elevating for us, right? Like, I think it was a clear signal that the automation of human intelligence was a lot harder than anyone imagined. There's a lot of hubris in those early projects that were going to be really easy to figure out. Then I see the turn to a more data-driven paradigm in machine learning and now LLMs. It almost looks to me just like an attempt to bypass the expensive bottleneck that was human understanding, right? It's like instead of trying to give AI rules to follow, we're going to let it find its own rules. And then we don't have to talk about our intelligence or try and get expert knowledge out of people. We're just going to see what the computer can do on its own. And for my part, data-driven classification, prediction, LLMs, like they're astonishing, right? But I don't know that I would call them intelligent. And again, these are definitional questions. And part of the reason, I mean, I guess like this embodiment problem, Hao Wang's questions are with me so deeply because like AI has no access to the world, right? None. It has no experience. It has no access to the world. All it has is the data that we give it, which is always partial and incomplete, and it has blind spots, and it reflects the values and concerns of the people who generated it. And, you know, I just see it as like pastiche of existing, you know, tokens, which just, I don't know, I find the capacities really compelling, but I find us a lot more compelling.
And would you still have that same thought if you just think of living in the mathematical world?
Oh, I don't know what that would mean.
But